Hi, everyone. So for this week, I'm going to be discussing the Advocacy and Fundraising in Oberlin College Archives case study from the Hackman book. Um, yeah, it's a really interesting examination of Oberlin College's archives fundraising, and um, I'm going to start by connecting it to some of the different types of infrastructure that we have discussed in this class. So one of the types of infrastructure that we have talked about fairly often is the placement of the archives within the organization. And this is something that Bauman mentions quite a bit in this particular case study. Really throughout the case study, he talks about the difficulty of getting the administration to even let the archives raise funds. He talks about how the development office was at first actively opposed to letting him approach donors because they thought that archival fundraising attempts would distract from other priorities that the university had. And even when the fundraising campaign becomes successful, the development office still refuses to get involved and refuses to help the archives raise funds. They do get approval for the fundraising from the university provost, but Bauman mentions that he thinks that's because the provost has a background in history, and so he might have felt an affinity for archives, and if that hadn't been true, then it might have been a more difficult sell. And even that took a long time for them to get that approval. So it seems like at Oberlin, the college archives wasn't really considered to be a priority, and administrators felt like there were other units and other causes on campus that they would rather see funds go to than the archives, which is obviously not an ideal situation for an archives to be in, right? You want to be a unit or a department that is respected, that is thought of as being a priority, and one that administrators are eager to help and support. Bauman also mentions that just generally speaking, without access to senior college administrators, it's more difficult for archivists to create and nurture relationships. And again, the more well-regarded and highly placed an archives is, the more likely it is that they are going to have an opportunity to develop these relationships with senior college administrators. You know, people make time for things that they view as being important and that they view as being a priority. And if an archives is not thought of as being a priority, then it may be more difficult for archives to get that opportunity to develop these relationships. So yeah, just a couple of connections to the placement of the archives within the institution that I saw in this case study. Another type of infrastructure that is especially important is the archival holdings, the actual collections that make up the archive. And Bauman talks about how the rich holdings that Oberlin had related to the college itself, related to Black history, in some other areas, was a huge asset when it came to raising funds, because if you have rich and useful holdings, then that is going to lead people to come and use your repository. And as I'll touch on later, Bauman was really proactive about reaching out to past users of Oberlin College archives for financial support. So the holdings really provided the connective tissue between the archive itself and people that Bauman would approach later on down the road for financial support. So if you don't have holdings, if people don't use them, if they don't value their repository because of the holdings that the repository has, then it can make it more difficult for an archives to have a connection with people and use those connections to ask for support later on. Another type of infrastructure that comes up throughout the case study is organizational culture. So Bauman talks about using an accessions register, so documentation of each and every donation that's made to the archive, past correspondence with donors, and systematic reference data as ways to identify potential sources of financial support. And if there wasn't an organizational culture in place that led to this information being collected and maintained over time in a systematic way, then this information may not exist, it may be incomplete, and this would make it more difficult to identify who might be a potential donor. So, it just speaks to the importance of having an organized and systematic gathering and use of data for a variety of reasons, really. But in this particular instance, it definitely seems like this information was very useful for OCA's fundraising efforts. And just looking at infrastructure overall to kind of encompass the different types of infrastructure that we've talked about in this class. On page 72, Bauman talks about how people give money to people whom they trust. And people give money to archives that they trust. And being able to operate in an efficient and competent manner is a key way to build that trust, as we've discussed throughout this semester. And doing so takes infrastructure, it takes resources, it takes having staff that are trained, it takes having staff that are leaders, it takes having an organizational culture, it takes having a good placement within an organization, it takes having partnerships with other individuals and institutions to develop this baseline of competence and skill and expertise that is a key prerequisite for a trustworthy relationship to be built between an archives and potential donors. Bauman also talks about how relationships are more likely to be productive when a prospective donor already holds a strong positive view of the person in charge and the mission of the program. So again, so much of advocacy is built on developing positive relationships. And a key part of that is having people in charge or people representing the archives that are respected by the public, that are respected by the people that the archive is approaching, and in order for that trust to be built, it's necessary that the archives has the resources in place to carry out its duties in a competent and responsive manner. So next we'll connect outreach with advocacy using some of the things that Bauman describes in this case study. So he discusses on page 69 how a network of contacts developed at reunion classes through commencement and through presentations to leaders of the Black Voice Footsteps to Freedom project were really vital in developing financial support for the archives. So again, if these outreach activities hadn't taken place, then those relationships may not have been developed, and it would be less likely that people who went to commencement or were at these Black Voice Footsteps to Freedom project presentations would be likely to support the archive. So the idea with every outreach strategy is that there are going to be people in the room or people that are exposed to a particular outreach activity by the archives that are going to be in a position to support the archives in the future, and that the outreach is going to be something that is going to convince them or help convince them that they should support the archives in the future. And it seems like Bauman's participation in these activities did just that. Bauman talks about how, generally speaking, outreach led to him being recognized as an expert on history topics. And again, that can lead to people trusting Bauman himself, trusting the archives that he leads and represents, and being more likely to want to support the archives in the future. And the best way to demonstrate your expertise is through outreach and through demonstrating to people that you are an expert in a variety of historical fields, and that your archives provides value by not only providing the materials themselves, but also providing the context necessary to understand the content of your holdings. Additionally, on page 79, Bauman talks about how donors familiar with the archives understood the need for financial support to preserve materials. So again, if you attract people into using your archives through outreach, and you are able to capably and competently support their experience as researchers, then that can lead to a greater understanding of what archives are, the type of support that archives need, and ideally this knowledge will lead to more of an understanding of not only the value that archives bring, but also the needs that archives have for preserving materials and also providing other services that archives provide. So obviously preservation is a big one that a lot of people understand, but of course, as we all know, archives are engaged in a lot of other processes related to other topics as well, like appraisal, arrangement, description, and so on. And so the more people understand these things, either through direct use or through other forms of outreach, the more likely they may be to support the archives in the future. So next we'll look at a few different tactics that the Hackman book mentions, and we'll talk about how these tactics are represented in the Oberlin College archives fundraising activities. So Hackman mentions building support networks. Bauman talks about how getting support from the Archives Advisory Committee to okay fundraising efforts was a big deal. It really helped to make the case to the provost that the archives should be allowed to go ahead and raise funds. Additionally, members of the Archives Advisory Committee lobbied behind the scenes, and that's always beneficial. If you have more than just one person going to university administrators and saying, we really think that the archives should be allowed to raise funds, that's certainly more powerful than just having one individual making that argument over and over again. It shows that your archives has sort of broader support in the community, and that is a powerful tool that archives can use to build additional support. One interesting thing that Bauman discusses is that early financial contributors took on advocacy roles or even became fundraisers themselves. So again, just another example of an additional support network. So people who donated to the archive and then provided additional support by either suggesting to other people that they contribute or by actually directly raising funds themselves. So the more support that an archives has, the sort of the greater the impact can be, because it's not just the archives doing everything. Additional people are helping out as well. And, that can result in a fundraising campaign having greater reach and more impact than if just the archives or even just one or two people within the archives are doing the work. And Bauman was also able to get support from college faculty and staff, which he said was gratifying. There was a lot of support from different professors and other members of the Oberlin College community who are interested in contributing to the fundraising campaign as well. So again, that's another example of a support network that ended up benefiting the archives during this fundraising campaign. One other tactic that Heckman mentions is start close to home for media coverage. Bauman talks about how local and regional press frequently featured Oberlin College archives collections in their publications. And again, that's a great way to increase an awareness of the materials that the archive has, increase an awareness of the value of these materials. And again, if people view something as being valuable, that may be more likely that they are willing to financially support it in the future. So the more you can use local media to get the word out there about your archives and about your collections, the better off you are going to be when you attempt to solicit the public for support. Now, obviously, if Bauman had tried to, get the New York Times interested in collection material that Oberlin College Archives had, that may be less likely to happen simply because there isn't as much of a connection between a publication that covers national and international issues as opposed to a publication that is more focused on the area surrounding Oberlin College. And also the people that read a publication that is local or regional to Oberlin are more likely to have some kind of connection with Oberlin College archives and might be already sort of predisposed to contribute financially in the first place. An interesting tactic that Hackman mentions is seek internal leverage through external fundraising process. That's something that Bauman did a little bit. He talks about how the support that he received from the provost to engage in a fundraising campaign was really helped by previous fundraising efforts that Oberlin College's archives had done. So they were able to say, look, we've done some external fundraising before. We have the knowledge and understanding of how this can work. And because we've been able to demonstrate this, we would like you to allow us to engage in a more vigorous fundraising process. So, success breeds success. And if you can show that you've already been able to fundraise successfully before, that may increase the likelihood that college administrators or whoever makes the decision about your fundraising efforts as an archive are going to say, all right, you have a track record of success. So that at least makes us more inclined to allow you to engage in more fundraising. Next, we'll talk about another interesting one, make good use of good and bad news. Bauman talks about how his standard appeal note referred to the slow fires of deterioration and the need for conservation and restoration work. So he really highlighted the danger that archival materials were faced with, and he used that as a way to generate support for the repository. So if people are unaware that archival records may be endangered, then they may not see the need to provide financial support to help fight that. And so as an archives, it may be helpful to educate them about things like the way that archival records can deteriorate over time, especially if they're not kept in ideal conditions, and just really make them aware of some of the challenges that are associated with preserving archival records for the long term. One key thing that Bauman really focused on in his fundraising campaign was personalized communications and follow-up, and I feel like this is a very powerful advocacy tactic. And it's one that Bauman writes about using quite a bit. So he talked about making in-person appeals to select possible donors. He talked about even going to their homes to make these appeals. So very personalized one-on-one communication. He wrote special notes to previous donors highlighting the uses of their materials, especially when these uses were done by students. So really connecting the use of these materials to the educational mission of Oberlin. And getting back to the accession register and the reference data, Bauman talks about how both of these were very important in providing the archives with information about who to send these personal appeals to, and really providing the context for the content of these personal appeals. So if you don't know who donated a collection or how often a collection has been used, then that really undermines your ability to identify who to contact for potential support and how to frame the communication that you're sending. So he talks about quite a bit about how these personal communications were much more effective than just kind of standard form letters or cold calls or less personalized interactions with potential donors. You know, people want to be flattered. They want to feel like you feel that their support is worth your time, and having some form of personalized communications can certainly convey that message. And last but not least, we'll talk about end runs around supervisors when it can build support. So one thing that Bauman mentions towards the end of the case study is approaching prominent alumni with papers at the archives for support, despite the wishes of the development office that he not do so. So obviously you need the support of your supervisors and other offices on campus that may be in a position to support you. But Bauman felt that because these people had papers at the archives that sort of put them in play, even though the development office may not wish to see him approaching them for support. So sometimes you have to kind of stick your nose out a little bit and pursue opportunities even if you don't have the support of your supervisors or people in offices on campus that may be more connected or more highly regarded than yours. Advocacy is about being opportunistic, and sometimes you have to be a little bold and a little brave. And in this instance, it seems like Bauman's strategy paid off because he was able to get support from these individuals. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there. I just wanted to talk about the Oberlin College Archives fundraising efforts and connect them to a few different things that we've talked about in class. It's always helpful to see some examples of kind of opaque concepts that we discuss in class and show some examples of how these concepts are connected to actual fundraising and actual advocacy at archives. And you'll be looking at the connections between infrastructure and tactics in your discussion posts for this week related to other case studies in the Hackman book. And so I hope that's helpful for you and helps clarify these connections a little bit more. So as always, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions and take care of yourselves.